speaking of horror shows, the MCU, according to many fans, has been a bit of a horror show of late. So there's been speculation recently like that the MCU is going to reboot after Avengers Secret Wars. So I just wanted to get your take on it. Like if let's just like a two-part question, right? Like A, do you think they're going to reboot the MCU, whether it's a soft reboot, like in universe, or a hard reboot, and it's completely start over with the MCU after Secret Wars? And then B, if they did do that, like how would you approach that reboot?
I don't think that they'll do a hard reboot anytime soon, because they've spent, I mean, decades building this thing up. I doubt that they're going to even soft reboot. I think that they're just either going to ignore the problems, or they're just going to like see like, all right, how can we work with this? Because this is canon, you know.
Right.
I don't see that anytime soon. I think they made their bed and they're going to work with it.
Are they going to lay in it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I am sad that, these things are getting delayed. I completely understand. I mean, the strikes are happening for a reason, and this is going to happen if all these studios are holding out. But I did hear that, is it Daredevil Born Again and Deadpool 3 was taken off the schedule? Is that correct?
Completely. Yeah, it was this week. I think we got the news that Daredevil Born Again was completely removed from the schedule. So it's delayed indefinitely. And then a few weeks ago, when Disney reshuffled all of their movies right after the strikes, the actors went on strike, they removed Deadpool 3 completely from their release schedule, which I can only speculate is because with so many moving parts, but also Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman's schedules are so busy as is that for them to try to keep up with the release date when they don't even know when they're going to resume filming is probably very difficult to try to work around their schedule alone, not to mention all the other things all the other factors. And there's so many cameos that we're supposed to get, like Jennifer Garner was coming back as Elektra was official. Yeah. And there's been rumors about like 100 other ones, like Liev Schreiber coming back as Sabretooth from X-Men Origins Wolverine, which I'm excited to see potentially that cameo, because I thought he played the Sabretooth character really, really well. It was different from the comics, but I think like his chemistry with Hugh Jackman's Wolverine was fantastic in that movie. So I would be excited to see that. But it's disappointing to see that, of course, with the strikes being what they are, and understandably so. As a fan, though, you still, would wish that these movies still came out when they were scheduled to.
I think the delay will be good for Deadpool 3 because they're not done filming, correct?
No,
which is good, because since Ryan Reynolds is a writer, he can't ad-libs anything, right, which takes away a lot of naturalness to it. I think that's ridiculous. Also, I think it's ridiculous that they're relying so much on cameos. That's me. That's just me.
I am a little concerned in some ways that it may become a cameo fest like Doctor Strange and Into the Multiverse of Madness, because that movie if they had maybe cut down on, like if they had done half as many cameos and focused more on because I felt like that movie at some points forgot that it was a Doctor Strange movie because it was so busy with cameos or doing other things that where they were like, oh, like people are just having that, like Leo moment with pointing at the screen, or just like standing up and clapping because they see like John Krasinski show up as Mr. Fantastic. So I definitely think there's a potential for that. Although I will say I trust Ryan Reynolds and his track record with Deadpool that they'll find a way to balance it out. Like we have done. Like the whole X-Force montage and that whole sequence in Deadpool 2 is probably my favorite part of that whole movie, where they audition people and then all of them kind of die on their way to their first mission, and hilariously so.
So, I mean, we're finally getting a Wolverine suit. I'm ecstatic about that. I mean, I think we've all seen the Wolverine post-credit where we were
hinted it.
Never saw it. But I don't know. It's hard for me to be excited about it because when I first watched Logan, it was such a big deal. It was so groundbreaking. It was emotional, and it was emotional because you're saying not only goodbye to these characters on screen, but you're saying goodbye to the actors portraying them, because that was their thing. Like we had like the longest run of characters, and then Doctor Strange comes, and you see Patrick Stewart as Charles Xavier, and you're like, I
it
want to be
just
excited, but you've kind of cheapened it, and then he immediately dies. Spoiler to this
right.
few-year-old movie. Um,
That felt like a I had a lot of conflicted feelings about that cameo because it just felt like that cameo maybe came like 20 years too late. Like
yeah,
or it just maybe not 20 but like 10 years too late. And yeah, like how special Logan was, like both within the movie itself and then just the circumstances surrounding it. It's just I think Logan is one of the top three comic book movies of all time. Like it's right up there with the Dark Knight and maybe like the first Avengers or Iron Man movie. Like it's up there. So
yeah,
and as a final as like a period on that X-Men franchise, because yes, they did do a couple other X-Men movies after Logan before Fox completely got bought by Disney.
yeah.
But
And that's
there was I don't think any movie of note that came out after Logan. So and I think most people's minds, Logan kind of like put an end point on that version of the X-Men in a way that I think was very it just I've never seen a Western genre adapted so well to the superhero movie
yeah,
movie anywhere, because we've seen other examples. I feel like the first Batman movie is like Batman Begins is probably like a Western in some ways, and maybe until the third act where it becomes like a pure sci-fi movie. But
yeah,
I've never seen a movie like stick to its guns to the end and see its hero like follow through on the journey that they set him out on all throughout, and just that sense of like it's like a long goodbye kind of a movie,
yeah.
but you also are hoping that doesn't happen, but then ultimately when it does happen it's satisfying, and yet like it's one of the few movies that like actually makes me tear up every time I watch it at the end, which is rare. I'm like, well, I do tear up like it like up and stuff, but like yeah, like grown man tears, like grown men were made to cry. It's like at the end of Furious 7, like you watch that sequence even today, like I put Furious 7 on and you see them like driving on and then just apart. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, but like getting back to the current state of the MCU, are you excited about stuff like Loki season 2 or the Marvels? Like, what is your level of interest on what's going on in the MCU today? Because that's part of the reason why a lot of people want it to be rebooted, because they just feel like we are well past its prime and there's not really much going on now that's anywhere near as good as what used to be the MCU.
I think uh, it's hard for me to be excited because the problem is that um, when the Avengers first came out, it was so groundbreaking because you're seeing multiple superheroes together in one
Right.
screen.
There was a novelty to it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And at that time, Joss Whedon was still a big thing, a big hit, and his dialogue was a very big hit. And so, even though you look back and the Avengers insanely campy now, but there's still that dialogue, that the Joss Whedon famous dialogue from Buffy. You can find videos of this online. Better essayists have done it before me, but
Yeah.
still, if you watch these movies, it's this kind of cringy 90s dialogue it's hard to listen to, like an experienced movie watcher to listen to, because you've seen it so many times and it's not natural and it's just tiresome. And you watch like these trailers and you're like, it's filled with this dialogue. And you can have bad visuals. You can't have bad sounding stuff. You can't. It's hard for me to get excited. I want to be, and I want to watch the Marvels, but I listen to the dialogue and I'm like, what are we doing here? You know?
It that movie, like as much as I love Miss Marvel and because I love that show on Disney Plus, I think it's probably one of the best things they've done on Disney Plus alongside WandaVision.
Yeah,
Um, I just yeah, like the trailer looks so cliche. Like it just
yeah,
I feel like I've seen that movie before. I just don't know if it has anything new to offer. And honestly, I think that's a harbinger for well, a bad outcome, because today it seems if you just go by the pattern over the last few years, post pandemic, during the pandemic, it just feels like since Endgame, the audience is out there, the general, especially like the average moviegoer, they want to see a superhero movie only if it really does something different in a way they haven't seen before. Nobody
yeah,
wants to go see a superhero movie that's like a by the number superhero movie. I think that's the reason why a lot of the recent DC movies have not been doing well, because despite everything, I think at the end of the day, despite all of the good things about a movie like Blue Beetle, and I love Blue Beetle, it was still a very by the number superhero origin story. The Flash had a lot of good moments, but it had a very basic story that just didn't feel like it, I think, challenged a lot of viewers. It wasn't anything different that we haven't seen before.
Yeah.
And then Shazam: Fear of the Gods is probably the worst example of the three, where it just felt like a very by the numbers sequel to a superhero movie. Whereas a movie like The Batman was different and in a
Yeah.
way that like enthralled audiences, and that's why it made so much money. The Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, it was different despite the fact that it was a third movie in the franchise. It just provided people with a send-off to a beloved set of characters, but also it had a lot of good commentary about so many topics, including animal rights. And so yeah, I just think like, and then Across the Spider-Verse, Into the Spider-Verse, those movies do something very different that people haven't seen before. So I think unless you're doing something novel or something that you can't do a by the numbers superhero movie anymore, it seems like. And I think the Marvels is going to be one of those.
I think you actually just made a really good point. I think what makes a lot of these new superhero movies so bad is because you watch the story and that's it. There's no
Right,
underlying story. There's no real
right,
big message. It's just like, here are these characters. They're thrown into this. Did you like it? And it's
right.
there's nothing. You're absolutely right. Like there's no real creativity in how you're portraying these characters. You're just doing visual effects or you're just doing cameos. You're just kind of like, I don't know, peekabooing us with like fancy stuff.
Right. And I do think like even in the height of its prime, the MCU sort of got away with some of this because they had like this like it seemed like there was this overarching connection. So people went to see certain movies simply because they thought it would connect in some way to the next movie that they wanted to go see. So even if you didn't care for Captain Marvel, that movie made $1 billion because so many people were excited to see how it connected to Avengers Endgame, which is like the biggest example of like Marvel kind of taking advantage of that,
Yeah.
interconnectivity of the universe to introduce lesser known characters that then just, people didn't necessarily care for the character itself, but they cared for how the character fit into the larger story of the universe. Whereas
Mhm.
they've definitely had movies like Black Panther where people went and saw the movie and the movie itself was a revolution and by itself, and then it sort of lent itself into the larger universe story wise. But now I think at a time when Marvel there doesn't seem to be some grand arcing plan, and like now with Jonathan Majors and
Yeah.
having all of the court issues, and like we just don't know if Kang is going to get recast, if they're going to pivot away from Kang entirely, because Kang has come on screen and been defeated twice already. First season of Loki, and then in Quantumania we've already seen very different versions of Kang, and in both of those movie and TV show he was defeated by the end of it, and yet we're going to get more Kang. So there's an anticlimactic nature to all of that that I think doesn't help them much. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's difficult now for Marvel to get away with introducing B and C level characters and for people to have the same level of interest. I mean, the first Ant-Man movie was a good example of introducing a very lesser known character, but that first movie was just so hilarious. It's so entertaining and watchable that you
Yeah.
can watch it today by itself and just pretend the rest of the MCU doesn't exist, and that movie's still fun to see. But by the time they got to the third one, it just felt like a by the numbers CGI slugfest, so you didn't care, even though it's the
Yeah.
same character as that first movie. So
Studios noticed like we laughed when a character was showing like weakness that they didn't know everything and they're like they laughed because he's dumb, write it down. And then
right,
like just
they're
made
taking the wrong
Scott,
notes.
who has a PhD, dumber and dumber every movie.
Right.
And then you have Kang and you were saying this where it's like this guy is supposed to be the biggest threat. This is
Hmm.
supposed to mark the next era of Marvel, this scary force who every time we've seen has been KO'd. Like he's been
Right.
out. So it's like what why should we be scared? Why should we even care?
It's almost like it's like 101 stuff, storytelling wise, 101. Like where one of the biggest reasons why people were so excited for Thanos in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame was, well, not just because, oh, people know him from the comics, because the average moviegoer did not know all about the comic book history of Thanos. But what they did know is how they teased Thanos in the first Avengers movie, in Avengers Age of Ultron, and like all the other Marvel movies leading up till, including Guardians of the Galaxy, like all of those movies, the little tidbits here and there, and the
Yeah.
various ways in which they kind of built him up to be this like big menacing force that seems to have been pulling the strings in the background the whole time. There was a lot of anticipation when you got to Avengers Infinity War. And then the real deal was about as good as, I think, one of the best superhero movie villains that you've seen in the past 10 years. So they definitely did a good job of paying off all that anticipation. But I just don't see that with Kang because they sort of have given us everything we wanted to see. Like, what can they do now that's different from what we've already seen? And if Ant-Man can beat him, like, no offense to Ant-Man, but if Ant-Man can beat Kang and if Loki can defeat Kang, then do we really need the Avengers to defeat Kang, even if there's multiple Kangs?
I
like,
mean, that's a really good
like,
point. I mean, it's at this point, it's just he's a C class villain. He just has a lot of versions of himself, you know?
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think from a storytelling standpoint, they've kind of mishandled it, but also, yeah, like you said, like, I think the multiverse does kind of if there's like 100 Kangs, eventually it just becomes it's kind of like if there's 100 superhero movies, you kind of get dull to the pain, like eventually. So like it
Yeah.
doesn't just strike you as anything new and unique and different that you haven't seen before. And Hollywood is all it's all Hollywood is entirely is a trick on doing the same thing over and over again, but doing it differently enough so that the audience doesn't know that you're doing the same thing. That's kind of storytelling in general. But I think when they do it at so surface level, it's very easy for people to tell that, yeah, we have seen this before. There's nothing new here.
Yeah.
But I think just to kind of wrap this up, I just last question. The X-Men, they're finally going to bring them in somehow. It seems like, well, we know that Miss Marvel is a mutant, so like we know mutants exist in the MCU now.
Yeah.
But is there a good way to do it without rebooting the MCU, like to introduce the X-Men, considering how the X-Men, like the history of the X-Men, it starts all the way back to like in World War II and such, and we just haven't had any of that in the MCU so far.
I think I think Miss Marvel was onto something where it's kind of like a reveal.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there's still a chance to naturally bring them in. I mean, the whole point of the X-Men and the mutants is that they're outcasts, they're disregarded from society. So why would we, the main audience, be able to see them? These people would be hiding. They would be in safe havens. You know, the Institute would be a perfect safe haven. And I think it would be kind of like one of those things where you find out like if somebody's kid is a mutant, it's kind of like one of those things where it's like you hide them in the closet. You know, it's just something that people know, but they don't talk about. So I think they still have an opportunity to make this a great like class struggle movie, like really kind of go into the whole Martin Luther King and Malcolm X side of things
Right,
when
which is like the origin of the X, but that's kind of where it
exactly, you
starts.
know.
Yeah.
That was the whole metaphor of the mutants was, you know, it was
Right.
prejudice.
Yeah.
So I still think there's a chance and an opportunity. What do you think?
I think you put it in a way that I haven't really thought about before. That in terms of like the best way to do it is to just kind of say they were hidden in plain sight the whole time.
Yeah,
And a lot of people like discard or disregard that idea because they're like, well, but what about this, this, and that for all these other movies? But I mean, hey, they introduced Captain Marvel before Avengers Endgame. And she was supposedly like around in the 90s and then went away for a while. But that was never mentioned in any of the Marvel movies before. I know we got the first Avenger, like Captain America, the first Avenger, the second, I think it was the third movie in the MCU. So it was pretty early on, and so it was kind of they integrated that character's history into the MCU from early onward. But even with the Fantastic Four, I mean, they could introduce the Fantastic Four as like some entity that was around decades ago and then they disappeared into some like other dimension, then they came back. Or
yeah,
yeah, but like with the X-Men, like you said, it's they could very well have been around the whole time. We just haven't explored that part of the history because it's like the real world. Like we have so many stories that we like. There's all kinds of untold stories about World War II that are still being made into movies that people would have never known about until they saw the film. And World War II like happened almost 100 years ago at this point. So I
very true.
definitely think there's you can use that as like a scale to measure against that. Yes, you don't have to have known about the X-Men before. There may be certain stories they can't quite execute well because if the X-Men were a complete non-entity before in a public eye, then that they could probably not tell some stories based on the previously established history of the MCU. But
Yeah,
definitely, I think that's probably the easiest and maybe it's like Occam's razor. Maybe the simplest solution is the one that you go with, and that might if it's written well, I think that could work. Definitely.
By the way, speaking of World War II, Magneto cannot be a Holocaust survivor. I just want to make that clear.
Because the timeline would be right, the age and everything, right? Because like
Yeah,
unless they take place in the 80s,
yeah.
like
It
the movie.
just like it should be. I think the X-Men should be in the now era. I think there's a lot that you can go over and make some connections, but they will have to find a different backstory, and I think that's going to get
Yeah,
some backlash. But they need to do it because Magneto needs to be older, but not old.
not old.
You know
Right,
what I mean?
right, exactly. Yeah, totally. I totally get that. I mean, because even in the 2000s, I think they were pushing it, but like they cast like Ian McKellen and stuff. So like
Yeah,
it worked. But like with the X-Men First Class, I think Fox realized at that point that if they were going to continue with the same backstory, they were going to have to set these movies in like the 70s and 80s and such. And I think I don't think the MCU's got any plans for doing that with the X-Men. Like, oh yeah, like like the Wonder Woman movies, like they all took place in the past. But
yeah,
yeah, there's a lot of questions about the MCU in general right now, whether it's the X-Men coming in, what's going on with the Fantastic Four movie, who are the Fantastic who are the it seems like we always get like new rumors every week about who they're casting in for Fantastic Four, but we're never
yeah.
gonna seemingly find out who actually is going to be in those movies. But yeah, I'm excited to see where the MCU goes, but I'm cautiously optimistic. I definitely think Marvels will struggle at the box office because it doesn't look like anything we haven't seen before from the MCU. But Loki season 2 has the potential to either be a surprisingly good show, or it could be even worse than season 1, because I just think at this point the range for MCU's quality level has gone from being like decent to great to now you can actually expect to get some really terrible projects from them, which is unfortunate, but hopefully we'll see more on the positive side and the negative side.